The Whispering Woods. 5 friends, Annie, Ben, Clara, Dan, and Emma, set off on a hiking adventure deep into the forest. They laughed and chatted, unaware of the danger lurking within the dense trees. The sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness enveloped the forest. Their flashlights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move on their own. The path twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the woods. As the sunlight dimmed, the trees seemed to close in, their branches whispering secrets in the wind. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. The others stopped, straining to listen. Faint whispers filled the air, too low to understand but eerie enough to unsettle them. "This forest feels alive," Annie said quietly, staring into the flames. The others exchanged nervous glances, but no one disagreed. There was something sinister about this place. "It's just the wind," Dan said, trying to sound confident. But as they continued, the whispers grew louder, almost like the forest was speaking to them. Clara stumbled over a root, her flashlight rolling away. As she reached for it, she swore she saw a shadowy figure dart between the trees, just at the edge of the light. "We should find a place to camp for the night," Ben suggested, his voice tight. They nodded, setting up their tents in a small clearing, the whispers never ceasing. As they sat around a small fire, the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that flickered at the corners of their vision. No one spoke of it, but all felt uneasy. That night, they each dreamed vivid, terrifying dreams. In Clara's dream, the trees had eyes, watching her every move. She woke with a start, heart pounding. Morning came, but the forest remained dim and oppressive. As they packed up, Dan noticed their trail markers were gone, vanished without a trace. "We must have gotten turned around," he said, though doubt crept into his voice. They pressed on, but the forest seemed to twist and change, making every direction look the same. As they sat in silence, a cold wind swept through, carrying a new voice, "Join us." It was soft but clear, sending chills down their spines. The forest was toying with them. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. "Help us," they seemed to say, voices of despair and fear. The friends quickened their pace, but there was no escape. Emma tripped and fell, her scream piercing the air. When the others rushed to help, they found her staring at a message carved into the ground, "No way out." Panic set in. "We have to keep moving," Ben urged, but the forest resisted their every step. It was as if the trees themselves shifted to block their path. Hours passed, and the sun remained hidden behind thick clouds. Exhausted and scared, they found another clearing and decided to rest, the whispers never stopping. Clara clung to Dan, tears in her eyes. "I want to go home," she whispered. But deep down, they all knew the forest had no intention of letting them leave. They continued through the endless maze of trees, each step filled with dread. The forest seemed to pulse with a dark energy, feeding on their growing fear. Ben spotted a distant light and ran toward it, the others following. But as they drew near, the light vanished, leaving them in darkness, more lost than before. "This place is evil," Annie said, her voice shaking. "It's like it's alive and wants to keep us here." The others nodded, the forest's malevolence undeniable. Night fell again, and they huddled together, too afraid to sleep. Shadows danced around them, whispering their deepest fears, each word a dagger of terror. Emma saw her reflection in a puddle, but it smiled back at her with malevolent glee. She screamed, the image laughing before it vanished. The forest was inside their minds now. They tried to keep moving, but their bodies grew heavy with exhaustion. Clara collapsed, and as Dan helped her up, the ground seemed to swallow their footprints. The whispers grew more insistent, chanting now, "Stay with us." It was a chorus of despair, the voices of those who had never escaped. The forest was hungry for more. In a desperate bid, Ben suggested splitting up to find a way out. Reluctantly, they agreed, hoping at least one of them might escape the forest's grasp. Annie and Dan went one way, while Clara, Emma, and Ben took another path. The forest seemed to laugh, its whispers rising to a crescendo as they parted. Annie and Dan found an old cabin, its door hanging open. Inside, it was dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of decay. They hesitated but entered, seeking refuge. Clara, Emma, and Ben wandered through twisted paths, the forest warping reality around them. Trees seemed to move, blocking their way and leading them in circles. In the cabin, Annie found an old journal. The entries spoke of others who had been trapped, their final words filled with madness and despair. It was a warning they were too late to heed. Dan heard footsteps behind them, but when he turned, no one was there. The cabin's shadows grew darker, pressing in on them. "We need to leave," he said urgently. Meanwhile, Clara stumbled into a hidden grove. At its center was a tree with a face, its eyes closed. "Help us," she whispered, but the tree remained silent. The forest's whispers became screams, filling the air with a cacophony of torment. Ben clutched his head, trying to block them out, but the forest was inside his mind. Emma found an old map carved into a rock, showing a way out. "Look," she cried, but as she traced the path, the lines faded, the forest erasing their hope. Annie and Dan fled the cabin, but the forest twisted around them. The path they had taken was gone, replaced by dense undergrowth and shadows that moved. Clara tried to remember the way back to the others, but every direction looked the same. The forest's voice was louder now, a constant, menacing presence. Ben saw a flicker of light ahead and rushed toward it, only to find himself back at the old campsite. The forest was playing with them, a cruel game with no escape. Emma's flashlight flickered, and in the darkness, she saw eyes staring back at her. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. She screamed, and the eyes vanished. Despair gripped them all. They were lost, and the forest was closing in, its malevolent presence tightening like a noose. Hope seemed a distant memory. Annie and Dan stumbled upon a circle of stones, ancient and worn. In the center was a carving, sacrifice. "What does it mean?" Dan asked, fear in his voice. Clara heard a child's laughter, eerie and out of place. She turned to see a shadowy figure, small and distant, beckoning her deeper into the forest. The whispers returned, softer now but filled with malice. "Give in," they said. "Join us." The forest was relentless, its hunger for their fear insatiable. Ben found Clara, but she was different. Her eyes were blank, and she spoke in a voice not her own. "The forest has us now." He backed away, terror gripping his heart. Emma stumbled into a clearing, where she saw a tree with her face carved into it. It was smiling, a twisted, mocking grin. The forest was playing with her mind. Annie and Dan heard the whispers change, turning into their own voices. "Annie, Dan, help us," they called, but it was just another trick of the forest. Ben ran, trying to escape the horror. He tripped, falling into a pit filled with bones. The remains of those who had come before, now part of the forest's collection. Emma found a path that seemed familiar, but it led her back to the cabin. Inside, shadows writhed, forming shapes that reached out to her, hungry and grasping. The forest tightened its grip, bending reality. The friends saw each other through the trees, but every time they approached, the forest pulled them apart. Annie and Dan held hands, refusing to let the forest separate them. But the ground opened beneath them, and they fell into darkness, the whispers becoming screams. Clara's voice joined the chorus of whispers, her fear feeding the forest. She was no longer herself, lost to the malevolent entity that controlled the woods. Ben clawed his way out of the pit, dirt and blood covering him. He heard his friends' voices calling for help, but he knew it was another cruel trick. Emma tried to carve a path with a stick, but the forest healed itself, closing behind her. She felt the trees' laughter, mocking her futile attempts to escape. Annie and Dan landed in a cave, its walls covered in ancient runes. "Maybe this is the way out," Annie said, hope flickering. But the cave was another trap. Ben stumbled upon a mirror hanging from a tree. His reflection grinned, a twisted version of himself. "You'll never leave," it whispered, and he shattered it in rage. Emma found a small stream and followed it, hoping it would lead to freedom. But the water turned black, and shadows rose from its depths, reaching for her. The cave's runes glowed, and Annie touched one. The walls began to close in, the cave itself alive and eager to consume them. They ran, but there was no escape. Ben and Emma met in the clearing, but the forest closed around them. The trees' faces leered, their branches reaching out, pulling them closer. There was no way out. The friends' screams echoed through the forest, becoming part of the whispers that tormented the next lost souls. The forest fed on their fear, growing stronger. The forest was silent once more, its hunger sated for now. The shadows moved, whispering secrets, waiting for the next unfortunate hikers to enter its malevolent embrace.